Hi, I'm Al Dare, and I'm normally at Mickey's Bait and Tackle tying flies and jigs, but today we're going to be doing something a little different. I'm at the studio with artist-author Peter Thompson, and some of you may have seen Mr. Thompson's work. It appears in Fly Rod and Reel magazine. In 2009, he did a book entitled Freshwater Gamefish of North America, an illustrated guide. A lot of his work appears nationally. Peter's work can be seen at the New England Aquarium in Boston. He's also at the Norwalk Maritime Center in Connecticut. And if you happen to ponder the Salmon River as a steelhead salmon fisherman in upstate New York in the Pulaski area, you'll find in Altmar at the DEC Hatchery his work prominently displayed. So Mr. Thompson and I are going to have a conversation about his work, his latest book. He offers a portrait service, and he's going to give you some examples of that work, and he's going to actually walk you through the process of doing a portrait. So this should be an interesting time. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Thompson. Peter, how are you today?
I'm pretty good today, thank you very much.
Why don't you give us a little background about you as an artist and how you reached this stage in your career, and we're certainly going to show some of the examples to our viewers of your artwork.
Well, I think I have to lay the responsibility for my love of fish at my dad's feet, because he took us kids fishing when I was a little guy. I always liked to look at fish, and when I got old enough to begin drawing, fish are what I drew. And in spite of my having been a student at the Boston Museum School of Fine Arts in drawing and graphic arts, I kept doing fish, and nobody at the museum school taught me how to do them, so over the years I've developed a technique which I am now fairly satisfied with, although it's very time consuming. And every time I do things other than fish, I just get drawn back to them. For me, they're just wonderful creatures that live in our backyard that we don't know that much about. So I've sort of taken upon myself to show them to the world to the best of my ability. And to that end, as you just said, recently I had a book called Freshwater Gamefish of North America, published by Fly Rod and Reel Books. And my career as a writer began when I proposed my first book to Down East in Camden, Maine, and they accepted the book. That was The Gamefishes of New England and Southeastern Canada. And I proposed it as an illustrator. They liked the subject and said, well, let's do a book. And after I got the contract, I said, well, who's going to write this? And they said, well, we don't know. And they said, oh, okay. So I queried a couple of friends, and they said, oh, we don't want to write it. And I said, well, I guess I better write it then. And so I wrote that book. And my second book was published by the Houghton Mifflin Company in Boston, and their editors taught me how to write. They took no prisoners. If they didn't understand it, it would be clearly come back on the manuscript. What do you mean by this? And to anybody who's an aspiring writer, I would say your editor's your best friend, because your editor looks at your work and says, I don't understand this, which means you have to write it in the way that somebody can understand. So I wound up writing books, and then most recently I proposed this Freshwater Gamefishes book, and which I both authored and illustrated. I'm frustrated sometimes when I look at fish illustrations, especially of trout and salmon, that don't show the scales on these trout and salmon, because they all have scales, including the brook trout and the lake trout and all of those chars, which have very small scales that you generally don't see. So, being true to my belief that illustrators should be showing accurate illustrations, I paint scales on all of the fish that I do. And there's a lot of people that say I'm crazy, and sometimes when I'm sitting here painting scales one at a time, I think I'm crazy too. But you folks will be the judge of that when you look at the work.
Why don't we see the book?
All right.
Why don't you grab a copy of that?
This was actually the first copy of the book, and interestingly, I gather reference material on fish wherever I can find it. fishing magazines are really good sources of that. Obviously for the glamour species that we most commonly fish for, being trout and salmon and bass and bluegills and fish like that. In the book, of course, I took it further and made a sort of a personal selection on freshwater gamefish. But I've covered as many as I thought are applicable, and I've put it in scientific or taxonomic order so that the reader can see which fish are related to which fish. This happens to be the trout, this is the golden trout, and the scientific order puts them in genus and species and then subspecies, and they're cataloged accordingly so that you can generally tell which species are related to one another. And again, I think that that's part of my job as an illustrator, especially of a quasi-scientific book, telling the reader, this is what these fish, this is the family that these fish belong to. Interestingly, some of the, what we used to consider trout, the rainbow trout specifically, were originally put in the same genus as the brown trout and the Atlantic salmon, Salmo, and were more recently put into the Pacific salmon genus, Oncorhynchus, because of genetic research. So this scientific order is not carved in stone, and taxonomists are constantly doing research that will occasionally change. It generally changes over a great number of years, but not always. And so we go through the salmon here, and then we get into the pikes, and again, as I said, it's in taxonomic order. And taxonomic order basically catalogs species according to, it begins with the most primitive and then winds up with the most sophisticated or the most recently evolved. Interestingly, for those of us who have attitudes about various fish species, it turns out that the yellow perch and the freshwater drum, here's a sauger, which is related to the yellow perch, but these fish are more highly evolved than our beloved trout and salmon. Not that that really makes any difference, but I find it an interesting fact as someone who's done this kind of research.
I find that amazing. And you said to me once that one of the most challenging fish, certainly to paint, is the sunfish.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love the sunfish that you do, the pumpkin seed, the...
One of the reviews of this book praised the fact that I didn't just do the glamour fish, the trout and the salmon. I think that for anyone going out with any kind of fishing gear, especially appropriate light tackle, can have just hours and hours of endless fun with these wonderfully beautiful native fish, the sunfishes. They fight good and they eat good, and they love flies, they love bait, they'll eat most anything.
That's one of my favorites, the pumpkin seed.
One of our most common is the pumpkin seed.
Absolutely beautiful.
And the bluegill as well. The bluegill tends to be more southern. A beautiful little fish. I've had hours of entertainment watching these fish spawn in a pond really close by my urban home here. Well, probably there are a few people who are as addicted to fish as I am, but I find it fascinating. And I also find it interesting that in doctors' and dentists' office we often see aquariums for the real reason that it's very relaxing to watch fish, as anyone who's ever watched fish knows.
Absolutely. And you talk about sunfish as far as being a part of a fisherman's memories and something you would want to refer to. Obviously, a lot of folks that started fishing years ago as children were tuned into sunfish right off the bat, and that eventually led to maybe some of the other species that are showcased in this beautiful book that Peter has spent so much time and effort. How long did it take you to actually do this book, Peter?
Well, there were some sort of technical difficulties, one being which I was assaulted during the making of this book, and then another of which there was a fire in my studio, so The whole thing took about 4 years. Probably would have taken about half of that had those two events
Well,
not taken
a bump in the road.
A bump in the
that
road.
life sometimes throws our
Right,
way.
life is.
When we come back, we're going to talk about the actual process that Peter goes through when painting these portraits, and some of which have backgrounds of the fish in their natural environment and some of which do not. So I can't wait to show that to you folks. So we'll be right back. Okay, we're back with artist-author Peter Thompson. And Peter is going to walk us through the process of how he approaches painting fish. Peter?
Well, as I said in the previous section, when I was a kid, I just wanted to draw fish. In fact, my 6th grade teacher said, I'm going to miss Peter's fish drawings. So it was very early on that I got started. And I continue to be fascinated by them. I have a rather involved process that I've developed on my own, and it involves starting out with a line drawing, which I do in pencil on paper. The whole process, I stick to this process because it's very flexible. I can change it throughout. This one, for instance, is a drawing of a steelhead that I did many years ago, and I'm looking at it now and thinking, well, wait a minute, those pelvic fins are a little too small, so I might go back in and then just enlarge those pelvic fins and say, ah, yeah, that's better. Some of the details in the head, I might think, well, let's look at that again and try it again. And then the next step in the process is to use, this is called drafting vellum, and it's essentially tracing paper, but it's heavy duty, so I can keep using it. And again, this is trace off of that original drawing. And then what I'll do is turn that over, and then I'll draw it onto, when I was in high school, I worked with watercolor, and I just became fascinated with watercolor. When I was at art school, we all had to do oil painting, and oil and I just do not get along. They will come out onto the paper behind, and this is stretched watercolor paper. Again, it's a surface that I'm particularly fond of. It's hot pressed, so it doesn't fight with me. I don't use canvas because canvas doesn't allow me to get the detail I want. And then the next step in that process is, once the drawing is on the paper, I use this battleship gray as the ground, which is going to be actually the fish's skin. And if you look at most trout and salmon, for instance, the scales are light on a darker background. In fact, the scales are almost translucent. The color of the fish actually comes from the skin itself underneath the scales. The scales are, if you scale a fish, the scales are almost transparent. And then, unfortunately, these are not being made anymore, but I have found a substitute for them. These are what are called tip pens. And basically what it is a little jar of acrylic paint with a metal tip on it of the proper size to paint the scales individually. And what I do when I have the battleship gray down is I'll draw a white colored pencil line for the lateral line, and I'll get the gauge for the number of scales. Rainbow trout have about 120 scales in their lateral line, so I'll do 120 scales down the lateral line, and then progress out top and bottom until the fish is all scaled. Yes, I know, you gotta be nuts. The interesting thing about that is that it's time consuming, but once you get so that you're comfortable doing it, it's just one of those things that's part of the artwork. And there's a rainbow trout that's completely scaled and ready to be painted. Now, the way I work is very much the way the classic Renaissance painters worked. I work in very thin glazes. I don't work with watercolor anymore. I do work with water-based pigment. Rather than using watercolor now, I use acrylic. The wonderful thing about acrylic is that it dries very quickly, and yet it's permanent. And so because most trout and salmon are going to have this whitish, silverish sheen on their side, I'd start by doing this. And then, just for example purposes, and then I would take an ochre, and as you can see, I'm sad that we aren't using film in cameras as much as we used to, because film cans are no longer as readily available as they used to be. Let's go with that. This is a little bit more yellow than I want. But again, this medium is very flexible. So the back of this fish would then start by my putting, and that's much too yellow, but I'll go back into that with various washes and change it. And again, as I said, the medium is flexible. I can lay that color down and then just a little bit of water on the brush, I can spread that color. One of the things I love about this Arches paper and it is that it's very, very durable. If I make a mistake, for instance, there's a little bit of paint up above the fish's back there, I can take a single edge razor blade and scrape that out. That's the beginning of the process, and rather go and then over and over and over and over, I'll take you from there to what's the end of the process. And this is happened to be the cover piece. This is the original cover piece for the Gamefish's book. It's a brown trout, as you probably can tell. And you can also see that the scales are rather prominent. Another variation on a brown trout, which would be a brown trout that's gone to sea, which are wonderful fish. The paper, by the way, is stretched onto these boards so that it doesn't buckle when I'm painting on it. Anybody, and probably everybody, has been in a kindergarten class or a first grade class and painted and had paper put on in the desk in front of them and painted on it with watercolor, and the paper all buckles. Well, you stretch the paper and it doesn't buckle. Sea run brown trout, steelhead, and one of my favorites is the brook trout. And again, there are not very many people on the planet who do fish that do brook trout scales, but as you can see from this, I've been true to form and done the scales. Now, these are what I call fish portraits. They're fundamentally illustrations. These are what most folks would want as a substitute for a skin mount on their wall. They're fairly easy for me to do. A good photograph of a fish. And if you do decide you want this done, I will tell you one of the secrets about photographing live fish. If you think you're going to have one of these done, take a white bath towel with you or hand towel with you. Wet it when you get the fish to hand and lay the fish on that white towel. Now, it might take you a little bit to quiet the fish enough so that you can get a good photograph. But what you're going to get for an artist's purpose is you're going to get a fish that's really easy to see, as opposed to a fish that's half in and half out of the water. Those are the basics, straight ahead portraits. This one has a little bit of shadowing added to it that gives it a little more of a three-dimensional look. And then lots of things are possible. I have a tendency towards surrealism. I like to tell stories in my painting. I sometimes get a little frustrated doing just fish and fish underwater. So I will do things like, in this case, a pair of steelhead coming up the Salmon River in Pulaski, New York, actually Port Ontario, New York, and the Salmon River Lighthouse, which is at the mouth of the river. And typical of an October day in this part of the world, there's quite a lot of color, not only in the sky, which Lake Ontario is famous for its sunsets, and color in the trees. And then I also like to tell more of the story by spring of the year in central New York. Having lived in New England most of my life, I had never seen a marsh marigold. And these are marsh marigolds, which bloom, one of the first flowers to bloom here in the spring, and they're just gorgeous. Bright, bright green leaves and these stunning chrome yellow flowers, which you would see at the time you might be fishing for brook trout. And you would also probably be likely to see trout lilies in the woods. And then I've decorated the border with the various flies that one might use for brook trout. Further down the road is an older piece, which I call In a Heartbeat. And I'm a fan of fish. So for me, fishing for fish if I hook a fish and the fish runs and jumps 2 or 3 times and then throws my hook, I think, good, I don't have to deal with this fish. We've done what we wanted to do. This is a picture of a brown trout feeding on some minnows and a fly fisherman fishing a dry fly and thinking that because he's seen the brown trout it had risen to his fly, when in fact it was chasing the bait fish. And it's called In a Heartbeat, and is just another possibility and is another way that I like to work and show what goes on in a day of fishing or in a moment of fishing. And I think that's all in my process, Albert.
Well, I love the fact that you tell a story in some of those latter pieces, Peter. But you also emphasize the idea that this is truly an alternative to a skin mount. Well, that was really interesting. I fish with Peter, and I'm telling you, he's just as good a fisherman as he is an artist. And I guess fly fishing is kind of an art, I suppose. But getting back to what Peter said about this being an alternative, that is, having a portrait done of a fish that you caught, this being an alternative to providing a skin mount, let's say, if you were to kill the fish and actually have it mounted by a taxidermist, I find that very attractive for several reasons. One, this is going to last a lot longer than a skin mount, and these are truly heirloom quality pieces. And secondly, a little story. I was talking to a fellow not too long ago that just purchased a camp somewhere in the Catskill region, and he was thinking about putting a fish mount in the camp, and I guess it was a joint venture between him and his wife, so he decided that he would run that by her. She wasn't too crazy about the idea of a skin mount, which, you know, I guess it's not just his man cave, so he has to take that into consideration. But what he did was, ultimately, he ended up procuring one of Peter's pieces. It was a brown trout, about a 20-incher. And that found its place on the wall, and it looks absolutely beautiful. And his wife loves it. So that's, you know, a little story I wanted to share with you. But if you're interested in a piece of Peter's artwork, depending upon what you want, whether it be a portrait or something that's obviously going to tell a story, as in the brook trout during the spring months, a little more complex than a portrait, or something that might remind you of a memorable location where you might have contacted with a beautiful steelhead like this. This happens to be on the Salmon River, as Peter said. These are available to you, and we would love to quote you a price. And price certainly would be dependent upon the complexity and the actual size of the piece. And I would urge you to contact us. You can contact us at fishingcny.com, or you can go to mickey'sbt@AOL and email us. And you could send us a photo of the fish. And keep in mind what Peter said earlier about putting the fish up against a white sheet. As long as you don't stress the fish out, or if you intend to keep the fish, that's not a big deal, I suppose. This is certainly something that you would want to consider. And also consider the fact that books are available through fishingcny.com, this lovely book. And these are going about $45 a piece plus shipping. And the author will sign the book for you. And again, we're glad that you're here to share this little moment with us and the artist Peter Thompson, author. And hopefully we'll have more of this type of opportunity in the future to show you something other than just tying flies, although Peter's a great fly tyer as well, and you can see some of his flies too in the future at some of these sites that we just told you about. So thanks again for being here with Mickey's Bait and Tackle.